My daughter-in-law sent me a chocolate cake for my birthday, but I gave it to her mother. Then, the chocolate cake my daughter-in-law gave me for my birthday was meant to kill me. I know that now, but it didn't. Instead, it put her own mother, Sharon Hayes, on a gurney being rushed through the emergency room, fighting for her life. And as I stood there, watching the chaos unfold, a single horrifying thought echoed in my mind. That should have been me. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The air in the Massachusetts General Hospital emergency room was a toxic cocktail of antiseptic, burnt coffee, and a palpable collective fear. It was a place where life hung by a thread, and tonight, that thread belonged to Sharon. I leaned against a mint green wall, the fine cashmere of my coat doing little to ward off the bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the late autumn air outside. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed mercilessly, bleaching all color from the world, turning worried faces into ghostly masks. The squeal of rubber wheels on linoleum cut through the low din of beeping machines and muffled groans. The gurney carrying Sharon shot past me. Her face was a waxy, terrifying shade of white, an oxygen mask obscuring her features, fogging with each shallow, desperate breath. She looked so fragile, so utterly broken. My son, Ethan, was completely undone. He had buried his face in his wife Chloe's shoulder, his large frame shaking with violent, silent sobs. Chloe held him tightly, her hand stroking his back in a soothing rhythm. "It's going to be okay, honey," she murmured, her voice thick with what sounded like tears. "She's strong. She'll pull through this." Her performance was flawless, a perfect portrait of a loving, terrified daughter. But then, she lifted her head. Her gaze swept across the hallway and locked onto mine. And in that one fleeting second, the mask slipped. Behind the veil of manufactured grief, I saw it. It wasn't panic. It wasn't sorrow. It was a flash of something sharp, cold, and calculating. A flicker of pure, unadulterated ice that chilled me more than the sterile air of the hospital. It was there, and then it was gone, hidden behind a deliberate blink and a fresh wave of theatrical tears. Did I imagine it? In the whirlwind of shock and confusion, was my mind playing tricks on me? But the feeling it left behind was real. It was a cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach. I clutched my old leather handbag, my knuckles turning white. The scene played again in my mind. Chloe's gift, her insistence, Ethan's strange nervousness, and now this cold, hard glint in her eyes. The doctors and nurses disappeared with Sharon behind a set of swinging doors. Ethan was still sobbing, completely oblivious. Chloe continued her act, whispering words of comfort that now sounded like poison in my ears. I stood alone, an unwilling spectator to a tragedy I had set in motion, and a participant in a crime I was only just beginning to understand. A strange, guilty sense of relief washed over me, so potent it made me feel sick. That could have been me on that gurney. In fact, it should have been me. And the woman who had orchestrated it all was now comforting my son. Just hours before the chaos of the emergency room, my world was the picture of tranquility. My colonial home in Wellesley was filled with the soft, golden light of a perfect New England autumn afternoon. Outside the large bay window in my living room, the maple trees were a riot of crimson and gold, their leaves drifting lazily onto the manicured lawn. It was the kind of peaceful, orderly beauty I had built my life around. A beauty that was about to be shattered. The doorbell chimed precisely at 2 o'clock. It was Ethan and Chloe, right on time as always. Chloe swept in first, all bright smiles and expensive perfume, holding a large, elegant box. "Happy birthday, Eleanor," she chirped, her voice a little too high, a little too cheerful. She presented the box to me as if it were a crown jewel. It was from Genevieve's Patisserie, a ridiculously chic French bakery on Newbury Street that was nearly impossible to get into. The cream-colored box was tied with a thick chocolate-brown silk ribbon. "This is their signature devil's food cake," she announced, beaming. "My mother adores it. I had to pull a few strings, but I had them make one especially for you." "Why, Chloe, that's incredibly thoughtful of you," I said, my own smile feeling practiced, polite. "You shouldn't have." "Nonsense! It's your special day." Ethan followed her in, closing the door quietly behind him. While Chloe was a whirlwind of energy, my son seemed to be moving through molasses. His shoulders were slumped, and he wouldn't meet my eyes. He gave me a quick, awkward hug, his body tense. "Happy birthday, Mom," he mumbled into my shoulder. Something was off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the air was thick with a strange tension. Ethan looked like a deer in the headlights, and Chloe's effusive charm felt rehearsed. It was a bit over the top, even for her. I placed the beautiful box on the coffee table, a centerpiece in the sun-drenched room. "Well, it looks almost too beautiful to eat," I remarked, trying to fill the awkward silence that had settled. "Mom, you should try a piece right now," Ethan said suddenly, his voice strained. He was fidgeting with the cuff of his shirt, his gaze fixed on the box. "Chloe went to a lot of trouble to get this." His insistence was jarring. It was desperate. My son, who normally had the patience of a saint, was pushing me to eat a piece of cake as if his life depended on it. I looked from his pale, anxious face to Chloe's perfectly composed smile. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in his direction. "Ethan, darling, let your mother breathe," Chloe said, her tone light and playful, but her eyes sent a different message, a warning. "We can have it with coffee in a little while." "No, I know how much you love chocolate, Mom," he stammered, running a hand through his hair. "And this is supposed to be the best in Boston. We should see if it lives up to the hype." I felt a prickle of unease on the back of my neck. It was the same feeling you get moments before a summer storm breaks. A shift in the atmosphere, a silent warning. Why were they acting so strangely? It was just a birthday cake. But standing there, caught between my son's frantic energy and my daughter-in-law's unnerving calm, I felt like I was walking on eggshells. I had the distinct feeling that this wasn't just about celebrating my birthday. It was about the cake. Everything, for some terrifying reason I couldn't yet comprehend, was about that damn cake. Hours passed. The warm afternoon light had softened into the cool, long shadows of evening. The house was quiet again, the air no longer crackling with that strange, unspoken tension Ethan and Chloe had brought with them. The dust had settled, both literally and figuratively, but the cake remained. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. It sat on the marble island in my kitchen, a silent, decadent monument to the day's oddness. I had busied myself with other things, replying to birthday emails, arranging a bouquet of flowers a friend had sent, but my eyes kept drifting back to the perfect chocolate brown ribbon on that cream-colored box. I had no desire to eat it. The memory of Ethan's desperate insistence had left a sour taste in my mouth. Just as I was pouring myself a glass of water, the phone rang, its shrill sound cutting through the stillness. I glanced at the caller ID. Sharon Hayes. I sighed and braced myself. A call from Sharon was never just a call. It was a performance. "Eleanor, darling," she began, her voice dripping with manufactured despair. "I'm so glad I caught you. Happy birthday, of course." "Thank you, Sharon. It's lovely to hear from you," I lied. "Well, I just have to say," she barreled on, not pausing for breath, "your daughter-in-law has some nerve. I mean, really. Your birthday is one thing, and I'm sure she moved heaven and earth for you, but she completely forgot about my wedding anniversary dinner last night. Completely forgot. Not even a card. Robert and I were celebrating 40 years, Eleanor. 40! And not so much as a text message from our only child. I listened, making the appropriate sympathetic noises, as she lamented the thanklessness of modern children. It was a familiar script. Sharon thrived on this kind of petty drama, collecting slights and grievances like they were precious jewels. And you know how she is, Sharon was saying. Always so busy with her charity luncheons and her Pilates instructor. It's like her own parents have fallen completely off her radar. I'm so sorry to hear that, Sharon. I'm sure she didn't mean it, I said, my patience wearing thin. After another 5 minutes of her letting off steam, the call finally ended. I placed the phone back on its cradle and let out a long, weary breath. The endless social maneuvering, the delicate dance of keeping the peace in our small, gossipy world, it was exhausting. My gaze fell upon the cake box. And then an idea sparked. It was a simple, elegant solution, a way to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. I could appease Sharon's bruised ego and, at the same time, gracefully remove this unsettling cake from my house. After all, Chloe herself had said it. My mother adores it. My decision made, I moved with purpose. I found a new, crisp gift bag and lined it with fresh tissue paper. I carefully placed the unopened box from Genevieve's patisserie inside. Then, I sat at my small kitchen desk and took out my Mont Blanc fountain pen, its gold nib gleaming under the light. On a thick, cream-colored note card, I wrote a simple message in my best cursive. Sharon, thinking of you. I know how much you love these. Hope this makes up for a little of our children's forgetfulness. Fondly, Eleanor. It was the perfect social chess move. A gesture of solidarity, a peace offering. I slipped the note into its envelope and placed it in the bag. I opened the Uber app on my phone, selected the package option, and entered Sharon's address. Within 15 minutes, a young man was at my door, and the cake was on its way across town. As I watched his car disappear down my long tree-lined driveway, I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. I had successfully navigated a minor social crisis with grace and efficiency. The problem was solved, signed, sealed, and delivered. I had no way of knowing that I hadn't just sent a cake. I had sent a weapon. Sleep wouldn't come. I lay in my bed for hours, staring at the patterns the moonlight made on the ceiling, my mind replaying the day's events. The forced cheerfulness in Chloe's voice, the haunted look in Ethan's eyes. It was a puzzle I couldn't solve, and it left me with a deep, gnawing unease. Finally, giving up on sleep, I slipped out of bed. The old house was wrapped in a profound silence, the kind that only exists in the dead of night. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the downstairs hall, a sound that had been the heartbeat of this house for generations. It was usually a comforting sound, but tonight, it felt like a countdown. My throat was dry. A glass of cold water was what I needed. I padded barefoot down the grand staircase, my hand trailing along the smooth, cool wood of the banister. The moonlight streaming through the tall windows guided my way, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like ghosts in the corners of my vision. As I reached the bottom of the stairs and turned toward the kitchen, I stopped dead. A faint light was spilling from the screened porch at the back of the house, and through the screen, I could see a figure, a silhouette, stark against the pale glow of the moonlit garden. It was Ethan. He was on his phone, his back to me. He was pacing back and forth like a caged animal, his movements jerky and agitated. I was about to call out to him, to ask if everything was all right, but something made me hesitate. It was the sound of his voice. It wasn't his normal, easygoing tone. This was a harsh, urgent whisper, laced with a panic I had never heard from him before. I shrank back into the shadows of the hallway, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. No, you don't understand, he hissed into the phone, his voice tight with strain. It's not that simple. We can't just wing it. He stopped pacing and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure desperation. Listen to me, he continued, his voice dropping even lower, more intense. I told you, it has to be perfect. Absolutely perfect. There can be no mistakes. Do you hear me? No loose ends. A cold dread, sharp and piercing, began to creep up my spine. What was he talking about? What had to be perfect? And then he said the words that turned my blood to ice. I'm not taking that risk. I don't want my mother getting implicated in this. Implicated. The word hung in the silent air of my home, ugly and alien. It was a word for police reports and courtroom dramas, not for quiet nights in Wellesley. It was a word that spoke of crime, of guilt, of consequences. The glass I had come downstairs for was forgotten. My hand, which had been resting on the wall, felt numb. It was as if the very foundation of my world had cracked open beneath my feet. My vague feelings of unease from the afternoon suddenly coalesced into a single, sharp point of terror. This wasn't about a forgotten anniversary or a family squabble. This was something else entirely. Something dark and dangerous. My mother's intuition, which had been whispering warnings all day, was now screaming. My son was in trouble. Or worse, my son was the trouble. And somehow, in some way I couldn't possibly comprehend, I was tangled up in it. The phone call came at 2 a.m, a violent shriek that ripped through the house's heavy silence. It was Robert Hayes, his voice a raw, broken thing on the other end of the line. Eleanor, it's Sharon. There was an accident. Oh God, she's at Mass General. They think it's some kind of poisoning. The world tilted on its axis. The next hour was a frantic, disorienting blur. I threw on the first clothes I could find and drove, my mind a maelstrom of confusion and a terrifying, nascent suspicion. Ethan's whispered word, implicated, was a drumbeat in my head. When I arrived, the scene in the waiting room was a twisted echo of the one from just a few hours before. But now, the stakes were clear. This wasn't a close call. It was a direct hit. Chloe was in the middle of a masterful performance. She was pacing the floor, her phone pressed to her ear, weaving a tale of tragedy for whoever was on the other end. We just don't know anything yet. The doctors are doing everything they can. Yes, of course. We're devastated. Her voice was a perfect symphony of calibrated grief. Ethan sat slumped in a plastic chair, his face buried in his hands, looking utterly destroyed. He was a puppet whose strings had been cut. Watching them now, after what I'd overheard on the porch, was like seeing a play for the second time. I could see the stagecraft. I could see the acting. And Chloe was the star of the show. Just then, a man approached our grim little gathering. He was in his 50s, with a tired face that suggested he'd seen it all. He wore a simple trench coat over a rumpled suit, and his calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the hysteria Chloe was projecting. He moved with a quiet authority that immediately commanded attention. "Mrs. Vance?" he asked, his voice low and even. His eyes, sharp and observant, flicked from me to Chloe and then to Ethan. "I'm Detective Harding." My heart gave a painful thud. A detective. The word confirmed everything my gut had been screaming. This wasn't a tragic accident. This was a crime scene. Chloe ended her call abruptly, her face a mask of sorrowful confusion. "A detective? I don't understand. Why is the police here?" "Standard procedure in a case like this, ma'am. Harding said smoothly, though his eyes never stopped moving, never stopped watching. He asked a few perfunctory questions. When did Mrs. Hayes fall ill? What had she eaten? Who was with her? Chloe answered them all, painting a picture of a lovely afternoon tea party that had gone horribly wrong. Then, Harding changed tack. He looked directly at Ethan and Chloe, his gaze unwavering. He asked a question that seemed to come out of left field, a question so unrelated to afternoon tea that it sucked the air out of the room. Were there any recent significant changes to Mrs. Hayes's estate planning? Her will, for instance? The effect was instantaneous. Ethan flinched as if he'd been struck. All the color drained from his face, and he looked up, his eyes wide with pure, unadulterated panic. He looked like a cornered animal, but Chloe didn't miss a beat. She laid a hand on Ethan's arm, a gesture that looked supportive, but was clearly a warning, a silent command to keep his mouth shut. She turned her gaze to Harding, her expression one of wounded disbelief. "Absolutely not, Detective," she said, her voice as firm and cold as marble. "My mother's affairs are in perfect order. I can't imagine why that would have anything to do with this." It was a lie. I didn't know how I knew, but I knew it with a certainty that chilled me to the bone. The detective's question was a rock thrown into a still, dark pond, and the ripples spreading out were revealing the ugly truth lurking just beneath the surface. My son was drowning in it, and his wife was the one holding his head underwater. The next day, the crisp, clean air of the New England autumn felt like a personal insult. The sun was bright, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the remaining leaves on the trees shimmered like jewels. It was a day for apple picking, for wearing cozy sweaters, for enjoying the beauty of the season. Instead, my home, my sanctuary, had been turned into a crime scene. 2 police cars were parked discreetly in my driveway, but their presence felt like a violation, a stain on the perfect facade of my life. Detective Harding was back, along with a team of uniformed officers who were going through my property with a quiet, unnerving efficiency. They were polite, of course, but their politeness was a thin veneer over their purpose. They were hunting, and I was the prey. I watched from the kitchen window as they fanned out across the garden, their black shoes trampling my prize-winning hydrangeas. Ethan and Chloe were there, standing on the lawn. Chloe had her arm wrapped around Ethan's, playing the part of the supportive wife to perfection. Ethan just stared, his face a blank mask of shock. He wouldn't look at me. "Mrs. Vance, we'll need to take a look in the garage," Harding said, his voice gentle but firm. I simply nodded, feeling a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie about someone else's life. I led him through the mudroom and into the 3-car garage. It was as neat and orderly as the rest of my house. Gardening tools hung on the walls in perfect alignment, and old furniture was draped in clean dust cloths. One of the officers went straight for the large, plastic trash receptacles lined up against the far wall. He pulled one out. It was filled with bags of dry, raked leaves from the garden. The rustling sound they made as he pulled them out, one by one, was unnaturally loud in the silent garage. He reached the bottom. He paused. Then he reached in and pulled out a small, brightly colored cardboard box. He held it up, enclosed in a clear evidence bag. Decon. Rat poison. The box was nearly empty. My breath caught in my throat. It was a plant. A crude but brutally effective one. I had never seen that box before in my life. "I have no idea how that got there," I said, my voice sounding thin and weak, even to my own ears. Harding gave me a non-committal look. "We'll just take this with us." As if on cue, his phone buzzed. He answered it, turning away slightly to speak in a low voice. "Harding." "Yeah. Are you sure?" Okay, got it. He hung up and turned back to me. The professional neutrality in his eyes was gone. It had been replaced by a focused, clinical interest, the look a scientist gives a specimen under a microscope. That was the lab, he said, his voice flat. The toxicology report on Sharon Hayes just came in. The substance in her system is a massive dose of warfarin. He held up the evidence bag. The primary active ingredient in this brand of rat poison. The shoe had dropped. The trap had been sprung. Every piece of the puzzle Chloe had so carefully assembled clicked into place. The cake, my predictable social gesture. And now, the murder weapon found in my garage. It was a perfect frame-up. All eyes in the garage turned to me. The officers, Harding, Chloe, who had a hand pressed to her mouth in feigned horror. But the only gaze that mattered was my son's. Ethan stared at me, his face a canvas of disbelief and a dawning, sickening fear. The carefully constructed walls of denial he had built around himself were crumbling before my eyes. He looked from the box of poison to my face, and for the first time, he saw not his mother, but a monster. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. "What is this?" It wasn't a question seeking an explanation. It was an accusation. In that single moment, the ground didn't just shift beneath my feet. It disintegrated. The suspicion of the police was a burden I could bear. But the doubt in my own son's eyes? That was a wound I knew I might never recover from. The world now existed in two separate, parallel realities. In one reality, inside a cramped, coffee-stained office at the Wellesley Police Department, Detective Harding was building a cage of facts. The air was thick with the smell of stale paper and cheap coffee. A large whiteboard dominated one wall, and it was quickly becoming a tangled web of my family's dirty laundry. He tacked a photo of Ethan, a smiling, carefree picture from his college graduation, to the board. Next to it, he pinned a printout of a ledger from an offshore sports betting website. He circled a number at the bottom in red marker, a negative balance well into the 5 figures. He scrawled a note beside it. Gambling debt. In the other reality, inside the quiet, oak-paneled study of my home, I was building a defense. I was out on bail, a phrase so foreign and humiliating I could barely think it. My home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a prison with gilded bars. The initial shock, the paralyzing fear that had consumed me, was beginning to recede. In its place, something else was growing, something cold, hard, and sharp. It was anger, a righteous, glacial fury. I was not going to be the fall guy in this sick little play. My laptop was open, the screen casting a pale blue light on my face. My search history was a grim litany. Warfarin overdose symptoms. How is warfarin administered? Common household products containing warfarin. The information was clinical, terrifying, but it was knowledge, and knowledge was power. The word Ethan had whispered on the porch echoed in my mind, a relentless drumbeat. Implicated. He hadn't said framed. He hadn't said blamed. He had said implicated. The word implied complicity, as if I were a willing piece in their puzzle. The arrogance of it took my breath away. Back at the station, Harding was on the phone, his pen scratching furiously in a small notebook. "Are you sure about that?" he asked the person on the other end. "Yeah? The family lawyer confirmed it?" "Okay, big help, thanks." He hung up and walked back to the whiteboard. He pinned a photo of a smiling Chloe next to one of a stern-looking Sharon. With the red marker, he drew a thick, angry arrow pointing from Sharon to Chloe. Underneath, he wrote, "Motive." He added another note below it. Sharon threatened to cut Chloe out of the family trust, told her lawyer she was throwing her money away on that deadbeat husband. He stepped back, looking at the board. The pieces were all there. A desperate husband with a mountain of debt, a greedy wife about to be cut off from a fortune, and a convenient scapegoat. The mother-in-law who delivered the weapon right to the victim's door. It was a clean, simple narrative. A prosecutor's dream. But in my study, I was starting to write a different story. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a mother who had been betrayed on the deepest possible level. The love I had for my son was a raw, aching wound, but the instinct to protect myself, my name, my very life, was taking over. They had underestimated me. They saw a genteel, aging widow, a relic from another time who tended her garden and hosted tea parties. They didn't see the woman who had built a life from scratch alongside her husband, who had navigated the cutthroat world of Boston society, who had raised a son she thought she knew. They had started a war, and as I sat there, the glow of the computer screen reflected in my determined eyes, I knew one thing for certain. I was going to finish it. She arrived without calling. 1 minute, I was sitting in the profound, unnerving silence of my living room, staring out at the dying light of the afternoon. The next, I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. I looked up to see Chloe's sleek black Range Rover gliding to a stop. A moment later, she was at my front door, ringing the bell as if this were just another casual visit. When I opened the door, the first thing I noticed was that the mask was gone. The distraught, grieving daughter from the hospital had vanished. In her place stood a woman I barely recognized. She was dressed in an impeccably tailored cream-colored silk pantsuit. Her hair was perfect, her makeup flawless. She looked cool, composed, and utterly in control. "Eleanor," she said, her voice smooth and even. "I think we need to talk." She didn't wait for an invitation, simply breezing past me into the living room as if she owned the place. She didn't sit, but instead walked over to the fireplace, examining a small porcelain figurine on the mantel. She ran a perfectly manicured finger over its surface before turning to face me. The pretense was over. The game had changed. "Let's cut to the chase, shall we?" she began, her tone casual, as if we were discussing the weather. "This has all gone on long enough. It's becoming a circus." I stared at her, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. "A circus of your making, Chloe." A small, thin smile touched her lips. It didn't reach her eyes. "Details, details. What matters now is how we end it. Cleanly, quickly." She took a few steps toward me, her movements fluid and predatory. "Eleanor, you should confess," she said, her voice dropping to a soft, almost intimate whisper. The words were so audacious, so monstrous, that for a moment, I thought I had misheard her. "You need to think of Ethan," she continued, her eyes boring into mine. "He can't handle this. He's falling apart. The stress of having his wife and his mother as suspects in an attempted murder case, it's destroying him. He's caught in the middle, and it's tearing him to shreds." She paused, letting the words hang in the air between us, heavy with poison. As she spoke, she casually glanced down at her silk trousers and brushed away a tiny, invisible piece of lint. A gesture of such supreme, chilling indifference that it made my blood run cold. "But you can make it all go away," she said, her voice hardening slightly. "If you take the blame, it will all be over. The police will have their culprit. The media will have their story. And Ethan can begin to heal. He can move on with his life." I was speechless, rendered mute by the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of it. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a threat, delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. She was using my love for my son as a weapon against me. "It's the last thing you can do for your son, Eleanor," she finished, her voice softening again into a tone of mock sympathy. "The final sacrifice a mother makes." In that moment, something inside me snapped. The shock, the fear, the grief, it all burned away, replaced by a white-hot, clarifying rage. I was no longer looking at my daughter-in-law. I was looking at a viper. She had miscalculated. She thought I was a weak old woman she could manipulate and discard. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Chloe's threat was the last straw. Her cold, calculated words echoed in the silent house long after her Range Rover had disappeared down the driveway. She had intended to break me, to scare me into submission. But she had made a fatal error in judgment. She hadn't broken me. She had ignited me. The quiet, simmering anger I'd been nursing for days erupted into a roaring inferno. All the pieces were there, scattered in the dark. But I was missing the one thing I needed to put them together: proof. And I knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, where I might find it. Ethan's old room. It had been largely untouched since he'd moved out after college, a shrine to a boy who no longer existed. He still kept a few boxes of old things stored in the back of the closet: yearbooks, college textbooks, sentimental junk he couldn't bring himself to throw away. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot I had. Fueled by adrenaline and a mother's fury, I went to work. I pulled the heavy cardboard boxes out into the middle of the room, the smell of dust and old paper filling the air. I tore through them with a frantic energy, my hands searching, probing, digging. The first box was full of old photos and letters. The second held textbooks on economics, their pages filled with his familiar youthful scrawl. It was in the third box, tucked beneath a faded university sweatshirt and a stack of old CDs, that I found it. A small black moleskin notebook. It was the kind he always used to carry, the kind I'd given him for Christmas year after year. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pulled it out. It felt heavy in my hands, heavy with a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to face. I sank onto the edge of his childhood bed and opened it. The first few pages were blank. Then, about a third of the way through, I saw it. His handwriting, the same looping, slightly messy script I had taught him at the kitchen table all those years ago. But the words he had written were a monstrous perversion of everything I had ever taught him about right and wrong. It was a list, a simple step-by-step plan, written out with terrifying clarity. At the top of the page, 2 words were underlined: Chloe's plan. My eyes scanned the lines, but my brain refused to process them. Give Mom the cake for her birthday. Perfect alibi. Mom will almost certainly send it to Sharon. They always have drama. Poison takes effect. Suspicion falls on Mom. Chloe inherits from the trust. We pay off my debts. We're finally free. I read it again and again. Each word was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs until I was gasping, suffocating. This wasn't just a plot to commit murder. This was a cold-blooded, meticulously crafted betrayal. They had analyzed me, predicted my behavior, and used my own nature against me. My predictable social graces, my desire to keep the peace with Sharon. They had weaponized it all. But the deepest sorrow, the mark I knew would never fade, was the handwriting. It was his, my son, the child I had carried, nurtured, and loved with every fiber of my being. He had sat in this very room with this notebook and calmly written out a plan to shatter my trust in order to pay off his gambling debts. The notebook slipped from my numb fingers and fell to the floor, landing open on the Persian rug. The cold, hard proof I had been searching for was right there, written in the hand of the person I loved most in the world. The rage was gone, extinguished by a tidal wave of grief so immense, so absolute, that it felt like dying. My son wasn't just implicated, he was the architect of my ruin. The interrogation room was a small, suffocating box painted a miserable shade of beige. The only furniture was a scarred metal table and 3 chairs. It was a place designed to make you feel small and insignificant, a place where truths were extracted like teeth. But today, I was not the one being interrogated. I was the one bringing the truth. I sat opposite Detective Harding, the black moleskin notebook resting on the table between us. It felt like a bomb. He had listened intently, his face unreadable, as I explained where and how I had found it. He then put on a pair of latex gloves and opened it himself, reading the single, damning page in silence. He read it once, then a second time, his expression hardening with each word. When he finally looked up, the professional skepticism was gone. He saw the truth of it. "This is quite the confession, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Written in your son's hand. It's the nail in the coffin." "I know," I said, my own voice hollow. "It lines up with what we were already putting together," he continued, leaning back in his chair. "We spoke to the owner of Genevieve's Patisserie this morning. She remembered your daughter-in-law quite clearly. Apparently, Chloe didn't just order one cake. She ordered 2 identical devil's food cakes, but asked for them in 2 separate, identical boxes. Paid cash for both. The owner thought it was odd, so she made a note of it." He let that sink in. 1 cake for me, the delivery vehicle, and another, presumably untainted, for them to enjoy, to solidify their alibi. It was diabolically clever, but the final, devastating blow didn't come from the police. It came from a place neither of us could have ever predicted. There was a soft knock on the door, and another officer leaned in. "Detective, Robert Hayes is here, with his lawyer. He says he has something for you." Harding raised an eyebrow. My heart skipped a beat. Robert? Chloe's father? A few moments later, Robert Hayes was escorted into the room. He looked 10 years older than he had a week ago. The usually robust, confident man was stooped, his face a roadmap of grief and shame. He wouldn't look at me. He just walked to the table and placed his cell phone down in front of the detective. I didn't know what to do," Robert stammered, his voice thick with emotion. His lawyer put a steadying hand on his shoulder. "They had a terrible fight last week, Chloe and her mother, about the trust, about Ethan's problems. I was in my study next door. I heard them shouting and I recorded it. I never thought—" His voice broke. "I never thought it would come to this." Harding picked up the phone. Robert nodded, giving his consent. The detective tapped the screen, and a voice filled the small, silent room. It was Chloe's, but it was a version of her I had never heard before. Raw, shrill, and full of a venomous rage. "You can't do this to me. After everything I've done for this family, you can't just cut me off like I'm nothing." Then Sharon's voice, firm and weary. "It's done, Chloe. I won't throw good money after bad. Not with that husband of yours." And finally, Chloe's screeching final threat. A promise that now sounded like a prophecy. "You'll regret this. If you cut me out of the trust, I swear to God, I'll get what's mine one way or another." The recording ended. An absolute damning silence fell over the room. It was over. The trap, so carefully set for me, had just snapped shut on its creators, and the final irrefutable proof had been delivered by Chloe's own father, a man forced to choose between his conscience and his child. They were placed in separate interrogation rooms, a standard police tactic to prevent suspects from aligning their stories. But it was too late for stories. The truth, in all its ugly, brutal detail, was already laid out on the metal tables in front of them. For Chloe, it was a war of attrition. She sat bolt upright, a queen on a throne of cheap plastic, her face a mask of indignant fury. She denied everything. The notebook was a forgery. The bakery owner was a liar. The recording was taken out of context. She was the victim, a grieving daughter being harassed by incompetent police. Her performance was magnificent, a masterclass in defiance. But it was a house of cards, and Detective Harding held the final fatal card. He simply pressed play on the recording of her father's voice, followed by the screech of her own threats. He slid the moleskin notebook across the table. He laid out the receipt for the 2 identical cakes. He didn't need to say a word. He just watched as the foundation of her lies cracked, splintered, and then collapsed into dust. Her perfect composure shattered, and a raw, guttural sob escaped her lips. The queen was dethroned. For Ethan, there was no fight. There was only a swift and pathetic surrender. The moment Harding placed the notebook in front of him, my son broke. He dissolved into a blubbering, incoherent mess, the way he did as a small child when he'd been caught doing something wrong. The confession poured out of him in a torrent of self-pity and excuses. "It was the debt," he cried, his face buried in his hands. "It was like I was drowning. I couldn't breathe. Chloe came up with the plan. She said it was the only way. She said nobody would get hurt, that your mother-in-law was tough as nails. I didn't want to, but I was weak. I was so scared." He was a stranger to me, this sniveling, cowardly man who blamed a woman, his debts, his fear, anything and everything but the rot in his own soul. He admitted to it all, knowing about the poison, helping to plan the alibi, planting the rat poison in my garage. He confessed not out of remorse, but out of a desperate, selfish need to abdicate responsibility. I waited in the hallway, a ghost in the harsh fluorescent light of the police station. I heard the doors to the interrogation rooms open. First, Chloe was led out, her face streaked with ruined makeup, her eyes burning with a silent, impotent rage. An officer walked on either side of her. Then came Ethan. His hands were cuffed behind his back. The sound of the metal clicking shut was sharp, final. It was the sound of a door slamming on a life, on a family, on everything that had ever been. He was sobbing openly now, his broad shoulders shaking. As they led him down the hall, he saw me. He stopped, his feet scuffling on the linoleum floor. His eyes, red-rimmed and swollen, locked onto mine. They were the eyes of a lost little boy, begging for his mother. They pleaded for forgiveness, for understanding, for a single shred of the unconditional love that had been his birthright. I looked back at him, and I felt nothing. The place in my heart that had held him for his entire life, the vast, warm space reserved only for my son, was now a hollow, frozen cavern. The pain had been so immense, it had burned itself out, leaving behind only a cold, gray ash. There were no tears. There was no anger. There was only a profound, terrifying emptiness. He was my son, and he was a stranger. The family I knew was gone, shattered into a million irreparable pieces right here in this cold, sterile hallway. A few weeks had passed. The media frenzy had died down. The whispers in our small town had faded to a dull murmur, and the legal machinery was grinding forward with a slow, inexorable certainty. The dust had settled, but it had settled on a landscape that was forever changed, forever scarred. I was sitting on a wicker armchair on my back patio, a soft wool blanket draped over my lap. The late autumn sun was bleeding across the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. The air was cold and sharp, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves and damp soil. It was a beautiful, melancholic end to a beautiful, melancholic day. I heard the soft crunch of footsteps on the flagstone path. It was Robert Hayes, and leaning on his arm was Sharon. She had been released from the hospital a week ago. She was thinner, paler, and moved with a fragile, deliberate slowness. but she was alive. She was a survivor. In a way, we both were. Robert met my gaze and gave a single, solemn nod. It was a gesture that conveyed everything and nothing, an apology, a shared grief, a recognition of the abyss that now separated our families. He helped Sharon settle into the chair opposite me, and then, with a quiet, "I'll be inside," he retreated into the house, leaving the two of us alone in the fading light. We sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the rustle of the wind through the bare branches of the oak trees. We had been social rivals for decades, our lives a carefully choreographed dance of one-upmanship and veiled pleasantries. Now, all of that seemed like a foolish game from another lifetime, a world away. Finally, Sharon broke the silence. She turned to me, her eyes, clear and direct, finding mine in the twilight. Her voice was raspy, a ghost of its former commanding tone. "He was your son, Eleanor," she said, the words simple, unadorned. "I'm so sorry." There was no pity in her voice, only a profound, shared understanding of loss. She wasn't just sorry for what had happened to her. She was sorry for what had happened to me. She was sorry for the son I had lost, not to death, but to a darkness I never knew existed. A single, hot tear escaped my eye and traced a path down my cold cheek. I didn't bother to wipe it away. I simply shook my head slowly. I stood up, went inside, and returned with 2 long-stemmed glasses and an open bottle of chilled Chardonnay. I poured the pale, golden liquid into each glass, the sound echoing in the quiet evening. I handed one to Sharon. Her hand trembled slightly as she took it. "We're both mothers, Sharon," I said, my voice steady. I looked out at the darkening garden, at the last of the leaves letting go and drifting to the ground. "We just are." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. It was a statement of fact, a fundamental truth that now connected us more deeply than our children's marriage ever had. We were 2 women, sitting on opposite sides of a tragedy, bound together by the shared, savage, and sometimes heartbreaking reality of motherhood. We didn't speak again. We just sat together, sipping our wine in the twilight, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. 2 survivors in the quiet aftermath of a war we never knew we were fighting. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment 1 below. If not, feel free to comment 0 so we know and can improve future videos. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching.